I didn't even have the decency to send a letter. Adeline Cross stepped off the train at Ash Creek with a single trunk, 31 years of quiet hope, and a name she'd been given in a telegram: Raymond Holt, rancher, Ash Creek, Montana. She had sold her mother's brooch to pay for the ticket. She had written her resignation letter to the school board on a Tuesday and cried about it alone on a Wednesday. She had packed every practical thing she owned and left behind everything she couldn't carry because Raymond Holt had promised her a home. The platform was empty except for mud and wind. She waited 3 hours. Then she walked into town and asked the hotel clerk if Raymond Holt had left any message. The clerk looked at her the way people look at something they feel sorry for but don't want to touch. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "Mr. Holt left Ash Creek 4 days ago, took his horse, his saddlebags, and nothing else. Nobody knows where he went." Adeline stood very still. Outside, the wind knocked something over in the street. She had nothing. She was nobody here, and the man who had promised to change that had already decided she wasn't worth waiting for. If this story already has your heart, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one, because there are more coming, and some of them will shake you to your core. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that train platform, because what happens next is something Raymond Holt never counted on. The station master's name was Gil, and he had a habit of watching people the way a dog watches a door. Not unfriendly, just waiting to see what comes through it. He had watched the woman in the blue coat step off the 240 from Billings and set her trunk down on the platform with the careful precision of someone who had thought about this moment many times. She wasn't young in the way of girls who don't know anything yet. She was 31, which meant she knew enough to be careful and had been careful long enough to be tired of it. She stood straight. She didn't fidget. She scanned the platform once, twice, and then a third time before allowing herself to accept that the scan wasn't going to produce a different result. Nobody was there. Gil gave her an hour before he walked over. He'd learned that some people needed an hour. "You waiting on someone specific, ma'am?" She looked at him with brown eyes that were doing a great deal of work trying not to show what was happening behind them. "Raymond Holt," she said. "We had an arrangement." Gil pulled his cap off and turned it in his hands. He hated this part. He'd done it twice before, told 2 women, separately, that the men who'd corresponded with them had found reasons not to be present when it mattered. At least those men had been local, and their excuses had been embarrassing rather than criminal. He didn't know yet what Raymond Holt was exactly, but the way the hotel clerk had described it, horse gone, saddlebags gone, no note left with anyone. That wasn't a man who'd had an emergency. That was a man who'd made a choice. "Mr. Holt isn't in town," Jill said. He said it plain because he'd learned that plain was kinder than careful. "Left about 4 days ago. Didn't tell anyone where." She didn't cry. He'd half expected tears, maybe a little collapse of the shoulders, the thing women did in dime novels when the world failed them. Instead, she looked past him toward the main street of Ash Creek, as if she were calculating something. "4 days," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "He knew when my train arrived." "I expect so." She was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed a piece of paper across the platform between them, and neither of them looked at it. "Is there a hotel?" she asked. "Holt's Creek Inn. Mrs. Parrish runs it. She's decent." "Thank you." She picked up her trunk herself. Jill reached for it and she shook her head. Not rudely, just definitely, the way a person does when they've decided that accepting help right now would cost them something they can't afford to lose. He watched her walk off the platform and into the main street of Ash Creek, spine straight, chin level, trunk dragging a little in the mud. He went back inside and sat down and felt bad about it for the rest of the afternoon. Mrs. Parrish, the hotel owner, was a woman of 60-something with the kind of face that had stopped performing emotions for other people sometime around 1878. She looked at Adeline Cross over the front desk with no judgment and no softness, and said, "How long?" "I'm not certain," Adeline said. "That means money's a concern." It wasn't a question. Adeline answered it anyway. "I have $11 and some change." Mrs. Parrish picked up her pen and opened her register. $1.50 a night. Meals included. I don't ask questions and I don't offer opinions. You can have the room at the end of the hall. It gets morning light. That's generous. It's not generous. It's what the room costs. Adeline paid for 3 nights and climbed the stairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the room with morning light and let herself think. This was something she had trained herself to do, not to feel first, but to think first, because feeling first had only ever gotten her into trouble. Her mother had been a feeler. Her father, too. Both of them had arrived at the ends of their lives surprised by where they'd ended up, as though the daily feelings had been leading them somewhere invisible. Adeline had watched that and decided she would be different. She would think. She would plan. She would be careful. She had been careful with Raymond Holt for 8 months. 8 months of letters. 8 months of questions and answers and the careful architecture of trust. He'd written beautifully, not poetically, which would have made her suspicious, but practically, which made her believe him. He'd described his ranch in precise, unsentimental terms: 400 acres, a working cattle operation, a farmhouse that needed a woman's hand. He hadn't promised her romance. He'd promised her partnership, which was what she'd wanted. She was a school teacher from a small town in Ohio. She had no family left. She had a rented room and a classroom and students who grew up and left and never wrote. She was not looking for a fairy tale. She was looking for a life. And Raymond Holt had seemed to understand that, which was why she had trusted him. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her trunk and thought about how she'd packed it. Every item chosen, every inch of space considered. She had left behind her mother's good lamp because it was too fragile for travel. She had left behind the oil painting of the Ohio farmhouse where she'd grown up because it was too large. She had given away her school books because she'd told herself she wouldn't need them anymore. She picked up her hat from the bed and turned it in her hands. 4 days, she thought. He'd left 4 days ago. That meant he hadn't panicked and run. He'd planned it. He'd calculated exactly when she'd be far enough from home that turning back would be just as devastating as continuing forward, and then he'd gone. The thought didn't make her want to cry. It made her want to find him, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that the feeling underneath that impulse wasn't entirely dignified. She put her hat down and lay back on the bed with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling and thought, all right, what now? The town of Ash Creek had approximately 300 people, 1 church, 1 school, 2 saloons, a dry goods store, a livery, a telegraph office, and the opinion of a place that had watched enough strangers come through to be skeptical of all of them. By the following morning, the opinion of Ash Creek regarding Adeline Cross had already formed without her participation. She found this out at the dry goods store, where she went to buy a few things she needed and didn't need to pay hotel prices for. The woman at the counter, Mrs. Dewey, who would turn out to be the primary engine of information distribution in Ash Creek, served her with a smile that was technically a smile, but had the warmth of a January window. "You're the one Raymond Holt sent for," Mrs. Dewey said. Not asked. Said. "We had a correspondence," Adeline said carefully. Mrs. Dewey wrapped the soap in paper with precise movements. "Well, you're not the first woman to have a correspondence with a man who turned out to be something other than advertised. I'm aware. Some women in that situation go straight back where they came from." Adeline looked at her. "Is that advice or information?" Mrs. Dewey's expression shifted slightly, not into warmth exactly, but into something like attention. She handed over the package. $1.10, she said. Adeline paid and left and stood on the wooden boardwalk outside and breathed the cold Montana air and felt the specific loneliness of being in a place where everyone already knows your story and got it wrong. She was still standing there when she heard the sound, a child crying, somewhere nearby, with the particular texture of a cry that had been going on too long and had stopped asking for anything and was simply continuing out of exhaustion. She looked down the street and saw, near the livery, a small boy of maybe 5 or 6 sitting in the mud beside a wagon wheel with both hands pressed flat against the ground, and tears running silently down his face. There was no one with him. Adeline Cross had been a school teacher for 9 years. She crossed the street before she had fully decided to. She crouched down in front of the boy, which put her good coat in the mud, and looked at him. "Hey," she said. "You okay?" He looked up at her. He had dark hair and enormous dark eyes that were completely wet, and the expression on his face was the expression of a child who has learned that asking for help doesn't always work. "I fell," he said. "I see that. Are you hurt?" "My knee." She looked at his knee. It was scraped, bleeding a little, not serious. She pulled her handkerchief out of her coat pocket and pressed it gently against the scrape. "Where's your father?" she asked. "Getting the horse fixed." He pointed at the livery. "Okay. He'll be back soon." The boy looked at her with the particular directness of very young children who haven't yet learned to soften what they observe. "You smell like my mama," he said. Adeline went very still. "She's dead," the boy added matter-of-factly, the way children do, which makes it worse somehow, the casualness. "I'm sorry," Adeline said. "She smelled like that soap." He pointed at the package under her arm. "The lavender kind from Mrs. Dewey's." Adeline looked down at the package in her arm, and then back at this small boy in the mud, and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. "What's your name?" she asked. "Eli," he said. "Elias Boone. But everyone calls me Eli." "Eli," she said. "I'm Adeline." He studied her for a moment with those wet, dark eyes. "Mama," he said quietly. Not to her, not quite. More like a word he was tasting, like he'd forgotten what it felt like in his mouth. Adeline heard boots behind her. "Eli." The voice was low and careful, and she turned to see a man standing a few feet away, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had been put through some weather. He was looking at his son with an expression that was doing approximately the same thing Adeline's had been doing when she'd left the train station, a great deal of work to stay composed. His eyes moved to Adeline. She stood up from the mud. "He fell," she said. "His knee. I see." The man looked at his son and then back at her. "Thank you." "Of course." There was a silence that had a particular texture, not hostile, not warm, just the texture of two people who have both recently had hard mornings and don't have much left for social performance. "Silas Boone," he said finally. "Adeline Cross." Something moved across his face. Very brief. She watched it and knew what it was. The name had gotten to Ash Creek before she had. "You arrived yesterday," he said. "I did." He nodded once, looking at his son again. Eli had stood up and was leaning against Adeline's leg with the absolute confidence of a small child who has decided someone is safe. She looked down at the top of his head and didn't move away. "He doesn't usually do that," Silas said. "Do what?" He gestured at his son leaning against her. "That." She looked down at Eli again. The boy wasn't looking up at her. He was just resting there, like she was a wall he'd found that happened to be warm. "Kids sometimes decide things fast," she said. "Yeah," Silas said. I was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "They do." She didn't see him again for 3 days. Those 3 days were the specific kind of hard that people who have never been alone in a strange place with diminishing money don't understand. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic. It's the slow arithmetic of need, each calculation smaller than the last, each option narrowing. She had $8 and change after the hotel and the soap. She had no references in Montana. She had a teaching certificate that might mean something if Ash Creek had a school with a vacancy. But when she went to inquire, she found the school had a teacher, a Mr. Finch who'd been there 12 years and showed no signs of dying. She asked at the hotel if they needed any help. Mrs. Parrish looked at her for a long moment and said, "I manage." She asked at the diner. The diner had family. She sat in her room on the 3rd night and allowed herself for the first time to do the math all the way through. 6 more days at the hotel. After that, what? The station master had told her the return train to Billings left on Thursdays. Today was Thursday. She'd missed it. Next Thursday, she could be on her way back to Ohio, back to a school board that would have already hired someone else, back to the rented room she'd given up, back to a city where she didn't have to start from zero, but would have to start from considerably below it. She thought about her mother's brooch, the one she'd sold, the one that had been her grandmother's. She was sitting with that thought when someone knocked on her door. She opened it and found Silas Boone standing in the hallway with his hat in his hands. He looked like a man who had decided to do something and was already half regretting the decision, but had committed enough that stopping felt worse than continuing. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Miss Cross." He looked at her and then at the wall behind her and then back at her. "I heard you've been asking about work." She kept her expression neutral. "Word travels." "In Ash Creek it does." He turned his hat. "I have a ranch. Boone Ranch, about 8 miles out. My wife passed 2 years ago. My housekeeper left in the spring to go back to her family in Billings. I have a hired man and 2 ranch hands and a son who needs someone to... He needs looking after, especially during calving season when I'm out from before light. Adeline looked at him steadily. You're offering me work. I'm offering you honest work, he said. It's not what you came here for. I know that. I'm not trying to... He stopped. It's honest work, room and board, and $12 a month. She looked at him. He was looking at his hat. Why me? She asked. He looked up. Eli asked about you twice. He doesn't know me. No? Something moved across his face again. But he asked. He doesn't usually ask. She thought about a small boy leaning against her leg with the confidence of someone who has decided something. Mr. Boone, she said, I want to be clear with you about what I am and what I'm not. I'm a school teacher. I'm good with children, and I can manage a household, and I won't steal from you, and I won't cause you trouble. I'm not looking for... I don't want anyone to misunderstand the arrangement. Neither do I, he said quietly. My wife is gone 8 months. That's not... He stopped again. I need help with my son. That's all I'm asking. She looked at him for another moment and saw something in his face that she recognized because she had been wearing it herself for 3 days. The look of a person who is doing their honest best in circumstances that don't reward it. All right, she said. When do I start? He let out a breath. Tomorrow morning, if you can manage it. I can manage it. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and turned to go. He was halfway to the stairs when she said, Mr. Boone. He turned. I want you to know, she said. I didn't come here expecting to be rescued. I came here because I made a decision, and the person I trusted with that decision made a different one without telling me. I don't need to be pitied. He looked at her for a long moment. I know that, he said. That's why I knocked. And then he went down the stairs and she stood in the doorway of her room with morning light and thought about what he had said and decided it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd stepped off the train. Well, she packed her trunk that night with the same careful precision she'd used to pack it in Ohio. Different destination now, different everything, really. She folded her good dress and set it on top and thought about the life she'd imagined arriving here and the life that had actually arrived instead. And somewhere in that gap between imagined and actual, she found something she hadn't expected. Not relief exactly. Not hope either. Just a small, stubborn willingness to find out what came next. That she had always had. It was the one thing Raymond Holt hadn't been able to take. She closed the trunk and went to bed and slept better than she had since Ohio. 8 miles outside of Ash Creek, in a farmhouse that smelled like wood smoke and the particular absence of a woman's hand, a small boy named Eli Boone lay in his bed and told his father, very quietly in the dark, that he thought the lady from the mud was coming back. Yeah, Silas said from the doorway. Good, said Eli. And Silas stood there for a moment after the boy fell asleep, in the dark, with the particular weight of a man who has learned the hard way that some things matter more than being careful. He turned out the light and went to bed and didn't let himself think about it any further than that. Not yet. The road to Boone Ranch was 8 miles of ruts and frozen mud, and a sky so wide it felt like a reproach. Adeline sat on the buckboard beside Silas with her trunk loaded in the back, and Eli wedged between them, the boy's small shoulder pressed against her arm, with that same easy confidence he'd shown in the mud outside the livery. He didn't talk much on the ride out. He pointed at things occasionally. A hawk, a fence post that had fallen over, a stand of cottonwoods near a creek, and she looked at each thing he pointed at and said something about it, and he seemed satisfied with that. Silas drove and didn't say anything for most of the 8 miles, which she didn't hold against him. She'd met men who filled silence with noise because silence made them nervous. This wasn't that. This was a man who was comfortable with quiet, which told her something useful. When the ranch came into view, she looked at it straight. A farmhouse, 2 stories, paint weathered to gray in places, a porch that needed 1 board replaced on the left side, a barn, large and functional, several outbuildings, a fence line that was maintained, a yard that had been kept up at some point and had not been kept up recently, the kind of yard that gets ahead of a person when there aren't enough hours or enough hands. It needs work, Silas said, not apologetically, just as information. Most things do, she said. He glanced at her sideways and then back at the road. The hired man was named Walt, 60-something, bow-legged, with a face like a topographic map of hard weather. He looked at Adeline when Silas pulled the wagon up, and his expression communicated several things simultaneously: skepticism, reserve, and the specific wariness of a man who has watched a household fall apart slowly and doesn't want to get his hopes up about the person who's supposed to put it back together. "Walt," Silas said, "this is Miss Cross. She'll be keeping house and looking after Eli." Walt looked at her. "You know anything about ranch work?" "I know how to manage a household," she said, "and I learn fast." Said Walt, which was not agreement but was not dismissal either. The two younger ranch hands, brothers named Cord and Pete Duffy, maybe 20 and 23, were more straightforwardly skeptical, which at least was honest. They watched her carry her own trunk up the porch steps without offering to help, and she didn't ask them to. She'd sort out what kind of men they were before she decided what to ask of them. Inside, the house told her everything about the last 2 years. It wasn't dirty, exactly. Someone had been making an effort, but it had the specific quality of a place being maintained by people who didn't know how to maintain it. The kitchen was functional, but grim. The parlor had furniture arranged the way furniture gets arranged when no one thinks about where to put it. Eli's room, she found later, had a torn curtain rod that had been leaned against the wall instead of fixed, and a small pile of mended clothing that had been mended by someone who was trying but didn't really know how to sew. She stood in the kitchen and looked at it and made a mental list. Eli appeared at her elbow. "Do you want to see my room?" "Yes," she said. "Show me." The first week was an education in what she didn't know. She could cook, but not for 5 people on a working ranch schedule where breakfast needed to be on the table before sunup, and the men came in at midday hungry enough to be dangerous. She burned the first batch of biscuits. She underestimated how much coffee 5 people drank before 7 in the morning. She made a pot of beans that Walt ate without comment, but Cord Duffy ate with an expression that said things his mouth was too polite to. She didn't apologize for any of it. She just did it better the next day. Eli followed her through most of her hours with the particular attachment of a child who has found something and is not ready to stop finding it. He wasn't clingy. He didn't need to be held or reassured. He just wanted to be near, to know where she was, to show her things. He showed her where his mother had kept the good linens. He showed her the corner of the yard where something had once been planted. He wasn't sure what, but his mama had watered it every morning. He showed her a small wooden bird his father had carved, sitting on the windowsill in the parlor, and said, "Papa made that when Mama was sick. He gave it to her, and she put it there, and no one moves it." Adeline looked at the wooden bird and didn't move it. By the end of the first week, the biscuits were right. By the end of the second, Walt had started leaving his coffee cup on the kitchen table in the morning without being asked, which was, she came to understand, his version of a compliment. Silas was harder to read than Walt, which she hadn't expected. I was present in the house in the evenings, reading or doing the ranch accounts at the kitchen table, but he was present the way furniture is present, occupying space without demanding anything from it. He answered when spoken to. He said thank you when it was warranted. He watched Eli with the focused attention of a man who has learned that watching carefully is the closest thing to protection he can offer, and he watched Adeline sometimes too, with a different kind of attention, less anxious, more, she didn't have the right word for it. Assessing, maybe, but without the coldness that word usually implies. One evening, about 10 days in, she was at the kitchen table after Eli had gone to bed, mending the curtain rod from his room. She'd found a way to fix the bracket with a nail and a piece of flat metal from the barn, and Silas came in for water and stopped when he saw what she was doing. "I was going to get to that," he said. "I know." He looked at the curtain rod and then at her. "You didn't have to." "It was bothering me," she said simply. "When something can be fixed and isn't, it bothers me." He was quiet for a moment, refilling his glass. "He likes you," he said finally. "Eli." "He's easy to like back," she said, and meant it. Silas set his glass down and looked at it. "He's been, since his mother. It's been hard to know what he needs. I know ranching. I know cattle. I know the land. I don't always know—" He stopped. "You know him," she said. "Better than you think you do." He looked at her. Something in the look was raw enough that she glanced back down at the curtain rod to give him a moment with it. "Well," he said, and picked up his glass and went back to the parlor. She finished the curtain rod and hung it in Eli's room and stood in the doorway looking at the sleeping boy and felt the specific ache of a thing she hadn't expected to feel here. Not longing, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sense of a shape that fit. She went to bed and told herself not to think about it. 3 weeks into her time at Boone Ranch, she rode into Ash Creek with Walt on the supply run and felt the difference in the way the town looked at her. Not dramatic, just a degree less like a cautionary tale and a degree more like a person. Mrs. Dewey at the dry goods store asked after Eli specifically, which was its own kind of information. The station master Gil raised his hat to her when she passed. She was coming out of the dry goods store when she saw him. She almost didn't recognize him, because she had built Raymond Holt in her mind from letters and imagination, and the man standing across the street didn't match either version. He was shorter than she'd expected. He wore a good coat that was slightly too fine for a place like Ash Creek, the way a costume is slightly too fine for a person actually living a life. He had the groomed, deliberate look of a man who knows how he appears to people and manages it carefully. He was talking to 2 men she didn't know, and he was laughing at something, and the laugh was easy and warm, and she thought distantly, of course that's what he sounds like. He looked up and saw her. For 1 second, half a second, something crossed his face that was not a laugh and was not ease. Something that was calculating and quick and then gone, replaced immediately by an expression of what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Miss Cross," he said, crossing the street toward her. She stood where she was and held her package from the dry goods store and looked at him. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I had no idea you were still in Ash Creek." He said it like an explanation was already forming. I'd assumed you'd gone back to Ohio after you left," she said. He lowered his voice. "There were circumstances, urgent matters that required—" "You knew when my train arrived," she said. "You knew to the day. You left 4 days before it." The easy manner flickered. "Not much, just enough." "I'll explain everything," he said. "If you'll just let me—" "I don't need an explanation, Mr. Holt." She kept her voice level. "I have a situation that suits me. I wish you well." She walked past him. She was 10 steps away when he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You violated the terms of our agreement, Miss Cross. I have letters, a contract. A breach of promise carries legal consequence in this territory." She stopped. She turned around. He was watching her with an expression that was perfectly, carefully sympathetic, a man who regrets what must be done. It was a very good expression. She could see how it would work on people who hadn't been watching closely. "You want to take me to court?" she said. "I don't want anything of the kind. I simply want to resolve this like reasonable people." "And what does resolve this like reasonable people look like to you?" The sympathetic expression held. "A small settlement for my emotional distress. The cost of the correspondence. The time I invested." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, and turned and walked to where Walt was loading the wagon and got up on the buckboard seat and sat with her package on her lap and her hands pressed flat against her knees and did not let any part of her face do anything at all until they were out of town and the road had curved enough that Ash Creek was no longer visible behind them. Then she let herself breathe. "Trouble?" Walt said, without looking at her. "Might be," she said. Walt drove on. "You want to tell Silas yourself or you want me to?" She looked at him. He was still looking at the road. "Myself," she said. "Good," said Walt. And that was all. She told Silas that evening after Eli was in bed. She sat at the kitchen table and told him the whole thing plainly. What Holt had said, the exact words, the expression on his face, the mention of a breach of promise suit. She didn't editorialize. She presented it the way she would have presented an arithmetic problem to a classroom. These are the facts. Here is the shape of the thing. Here is what we are dealing with. Silas listened with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set in a way that made something in his face look slightly younger and considerably more dangerous than usual. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's back in town," he said. "Nobody knew he was coming back." "He came back because I was still here," she said. "If I'd gone back to Ohio, there would be nothing to threaten." "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know that." "A breach of promise suit." He stopped. "He'd have to prove there was a contract. That you violated it. He was the one who left. He was the one who left, she agreed. But he has letters. Written correspondence. He'll find a way to present it as though I failed to fulfill something, and he'll find people in town who believe him before they believe me, because he's been here and I've been here for 4 weeks, and he's better at being believed than I am. Silas looked at her. You're not afraid of him. It wasn't quite a question. She thought about it anyway. I'm afraid of what he can do to my name, she said. That's real. A woman's reputation in a place like this is about the only currency she has. But afraid of him? She shook her head. No. I looked at him today and I thought, there's a man who's done this before. You don't get that practiced at that particular expression unless you've used it more than once. Silas was very still. You think he's done this to other women? I think it's possible, she said. And if it's possible, then there might be something to find. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you want to do? She had thought about this on the 8 miles back from town, watching the road and letting Walt's silence be useful. I want to write some letters, she said, and I want to talk to whoever handles legal matters in Ash Creek. And I want to know more about Raymond Holt than he wants me to know. Silas nodded slowly. There's a man named Hargrove. Handles contracts, deeds, civil matters. He's in the telegraph office building on Tuesdays. Tuesday is 4 days away. In the meantime, Silas said, Holt's been talking to people. She looked at him. Mrs. Dewey came out to the fence line this afternoon while you were in town with Walt, he said. Wanted to tell me that Holt has been saying you wrote him letters withdrawing from the arrangement, that you changed your mind and he came back to be gentleman enough to discuss it with you. The arithmetic of it landed clean and cold. He hadn't come back to threaten her into a settlement. He'd come back to do something more efficient, to be the wronged party before she even knew the case was being built, to make people feel sorry for him before she had a chance to tell them what actually happened. He came back to make me the one who left him, she said. That's what it looks like. She sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, something moved in the yard, a horse shifting in the barn, a sound like the property breathing. He's smarter than I gave him credit for, she said. Does that change anything? She thought about Ohio, about the lamp she'd left behind, about the brooch. No, she said, Basham. The next morning she was up before 5, which was her usual time now. Silas and the hands needed breakfast at 5:30, and the kitchen needed time, and she was standing at the stove when she heard Eli behind her. You're up early, she said, without turning around. Couldn't sleep. His voice was still thick with it. Are you in trouble? She turned and looked at him, 5 years old, standing in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with his dark hair sideways from the pillow. Where'd you hear that? She said carefully. Papa was talking to Walt last night after he thought I was asleep. He came and stood beside the stove, drawn to the warmth. Is the man from town going to make you go away? She crouched down so she was level with him. He looked at her with those dark, serious eyes that were too old for 5, and also completely 5 simultaneously. Nobody is making me go anywhere, she said. Not unless I decide to go. And I haven't decided that. You promise? She looked at him. She thought about the kind of promises that get made to children and the weight they carry and the damage they do when they break. I promise I'll tell you the truth, she said. If something changes, I'll tell you before it happens. That's what I can promise. He thought about this seriously, with the thoroughness of a child evaluating an offer. Okay, he said. Okay, she said, and stood up and handed him a piece of bread with butter on it, which he took without ceremony and ate standing beside the stove, warm and quiet, while she put the coffee on. Silas appeared at 5:15 and stopped in the kitchen doorway at the sight of his son standing at Adeline's elbow eating bread. Something moved across his face that he didn't entirely hide before he looked away and poured himself a cup of coffee. Sleep all right? Adeline asked him. Enough, he said, which meant no. By the end of that week, the shape of what Holt was doing had become clear in the particular way that small-town machinery becomes clear, not in any one moment, but in the accumulation of small things. The way Mrs. Dewey asked Adeline questions that weren't really questions, but were really the questions Holt wanted answered. The way one of the men at the livery made a comment to Walt about that Ohio woman and the trouble she brought with her. The way the Duffy brothers, Cord and Pete, were quieter at breakfast than usual, exchanging looks she caught, but wasn't meant to. On Saturday, she came into the barn to ask Walt something and found Cord Duffy talking to a man she didn't recognize. Well-dressed, not from the ranch, not from town either. The particular look of someone passing through with purpose. The man glanced at her and said something low to Cord and left. "Who was that?" she asked Walt afterward. "Lawyer," Walt said. "Name of Beaumont. From Billings." She stood with that. "Holt hired a lawyer from Billings," she said. "Yep." "To handle a breach of promise suit against a woman with no money." Walt looked at her sideways. "When a man hires a lawyer from out of town, it means one of two things. Either the local options aren't good enough, or he doesn't want local people knowing too much about what he's doing." She thought about that. What was Cord talking to him about? Walt was quiet for a beat too long. "Walt. Cord's been in town 3 times this week on his own time," Walt said carefully. "That's all I know." She looked at the barn door where the lawyer had walked out, and she felt the ground shift under her in the way it does when you realize the fight you thought you were in is larger than you understood. Cord Duffy was talking to Holt's lawyer, which meant Holt had found a way into the ranch, into Silas's own household, before she'd had a chance to build a case. She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and took a piece of paper and started writing. The first letter went to the postmistress in Laramie, Wyoming, where one of Holt's early letters had mentioned a previous property. The second went to a school teacher she'd corresponded with briefly in Nebraska, who had mentioned once a rancher who'd advertised for a wife and then disappeared. The third she addressed to a name she barely remembered from a conversation at the train station in Billings on her way here, a woman who'd mentioned knowing a man named Holt from somewhere in the Dakotas. She didn't know if any of these would come to anything. She didn't know if she had time for them to come to anything before Holt's lawyer from Billings did whatever he'd been hired to do. But she had been a school teacher for 9 years, and the one thing 9 years of teaching had given her, more than patience, more than classroom management, more than any practical skill, was this: the knowledge that problems which look impossible are usually just problems you don't have enough information about yet. She sealed the letters and addressed them carefully and put them in her coat pocket for the supply run Monday morning. Silas found her there when he came in for lunch. He looked at the letters and then at her face and didn't ask. He poured himself water and stood at the counter drinking it, and after a moment he said, "Beaumont was in town this morning, filed something with the territorial clerk." She looked up. "It's real," she said. "Not a question. There's going to be a hearing, 3 weeks. 3 weeks." She looked at her sealed letters and then at the window and then at her hands on the table. 3 weeks, she said. "Yeah." She picked up the letters and straightened them against the table. "Then I'd better find out what I need to know before then." Silas looked at her. That look again, the one she still didn't have a clean word for. "I'll come with you Monday," he said. "To town, if you want." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. He was looking out the window. Outside, Eli was in the yard doing something with a stick and a fence post, some complicated private game that seemed to require a great deal of negotiation with the fence post. "All right," she said. "Monday." He nodded and set his glass in the wash basin and went back out. She watched him through the window cross the yard to where Eli was, and Eli looked up and said something, and Silas listened to it with complete seriousness and then said something back, and Eli laughed, sudden and bright and startling as a bird flying up from the grass. She turned away from the window and looked at her letters. 3 weeks. Raymond Holt, a lawyer from Billings, a ranch hand who'd been visiting that lawyer, and a town that had been hearing his version of events for a week while she'd been 8 miles away cooking biscuits and mending curtain rods. She put on her coat and went out to the yard and mailed nothing yet, because the post didn't go until Monday, and she had 4 days to decide what else needed to be in those letters before she sent them. But she'd started, and she had learned in 31 years of being herself that starting was the thing, everything else was just continuing. Monday came with cold air and a sky the color of old pewter, and Silas had the wagon ready before Adeline finished the breakfast dishes. She'd been up since 4:30, not because she needed to be, but because sleep had stopped working around 2 in the morning, and lying in the dark pretending otherwise seemed like a waste of the only hours she had to herself. She'd used the time to read back through every letter Raymond Holt had ever sent her, laid out on the kitchen table in chronological order, lamplight making everything look amber and older than it was. Reading them now was a different experience than reading them the first time. The first time she'd been reading for what was there. Now she was reading for what was missing, the careful absences, the questions he'd redirected, the specific facts he'd declined to provide while seeming to provide everything. He'd never given her the name of his lawyer. He'd never mentioned a bank. He'd described the ranch in detail, but never offered a deed reference, and she'd never asked for one because she'd been trusting, and she was done being angry at herself about that. What she was not done with was the reading. By the time she blew out the lamp, she had a list. Not of proof, not yet, but of the shape of the gaps, and the shape of gaps she'd found tells you almost as much as the things that fill them. Silas said nothing about the dark circles under her eyes when she climbed up onto the buckboard. He said, "Eli's with Walt today. Walt knows." She nodded. They drove. The road into Ash Creek was starting to feel familiar in the way that roads do when you've traveled them enough times with enough on your mind. She knew where the ruts were, knew the bend where the cottonwoods leaned, knew the particular stretch where the wind came sideways, and you had to hold your hat. Familiarity wasn't comfort, but it was something. It was the land beginning to know her back. "I want to go to the telegraph office first," she said, "before Hargrove." "The post goes out at 9, Silas said. "I know." He didn't ask what was in the letters. She appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. She mailed all 3 letters at 8:50 and stood at the counter while the clerk, a young man named Foster who was trying to grow a mustache with mixed results, stamped and sorted them, and she watched each one disappear into the outgoing pile with the particular feeling of having thrown something into a river and not knowing yet if it would float. Then she went to find Hargrove. His name was Edmund Hargrove, and he worked out of a single room on the second floor of the building that housed the telegraph office, a space barely large enough for his desk, 2 chairs, and the filing cabinet that appeared to be losing a long war with the documents it was supposed to contain. He was 60, dry, precise, with the manner of a man who has spent decades in a profession where imprecision costs people things they can't get back. He read the filing that Beaumont, Holt's Billings lawyer, had submitted to the territorial clerk. He read it twice. He set it down and looked at Adeline over his spectacles. "Breach of promise," he said. "He's claiming you entered a formal agreement of marriage, accepted consideration in the form of correspondence and preparatory arrangements, and then failed to fulfill the agreement." "He left before I arrived," she said. "He'll claim he left due to your prior withdrawal from the arrangement, that you sent a letter indicating you no longer wish to proceed." "I sent no such letter." "Do you have copies of your correspondence?" "I have every letter he sent me. I cannot produce copies of what I sent him because I didn't keep them. I didn't think I'd need to." Hargrove looked at her without expression. "Few people do." "What does Beaumont's filing actually claim, specifically?" He picked up the document again. "That you violated the agreement, that Holt suffered financial and emotional harm as a result, and that he is entitled to compensation in the amount of—" He paused. $450. The number sat in the small room between them. $450, Adeline said. "Yes." "That is not a number that comes from emotional distress," she said. "That's a number that comes from knowing approximately what a schoolteacher might have in savings and asking for slightly more than she has. So the easiest resolution is to pay him something to make it stop." Hargrove looked at her for a moment. "That is a fairly sophisticated reading of the situation." "I've had time to think." "What do you want to do, Miss Cross?" "I want to fight it," she said. "I want to prove he's done this before, and I want to prove he left of his own deliberate choice. And I want to know whether there's anything in the territorial records about Raymond Holt that Beaumont would prefer I didn't know. That will cost money. My time isn't—" "How much?" He named a number. She looked at Silas, who was sitting in the second chair with his hat on his knee and his expression giving nothing away, and he said, "I'll cover it," without looking at her, in the tone of a man foreclosing a discussion. "Silas, write it down as a loan if it bothers you," he said. "We can argue about it later." Hargrove looked between them and made the professional decision not to have opinions about it. "All right," he said, and picked up his pen. "Tell me everything, starting from the first letter." "What?" She talked for over an hour. Hargrove wrote in his cramped, efficient hand and asked questions that were always specific and never sympathetic, which she appreciated because sympathy would have slowed her down. When she finished, he read back through his notes and made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a grunt, but was somewhere between the two. "The first thing I'll do," he said, "is request the territorial property records for Holt's Ranch. If he sold it before you arrived, if the property transfer happened before your train reached Ash Creek, that establishes that he was not simply delayed. It establishes he planned to be gone. Can you get those records in time? The hearing is in 18 days. I'll telegraph Billings today. He paused. The clerk here, Foster. He's good with the telegraph, and he owes me a favor from a property dispute last winter. We'll get the records. What about the other men? She said. The letters I sent. If you hear back before the hearing, bring me whatever you receive. Written statements from other women he approached under similar circumstances would establish a pattern. That's significant. That changes this from a disputed personal arrangement into something that looks considerably more deliberate. She nodded. She was already thinking about what else she could do in 18 days. One more thing, Hargrove said, and his tone changed slightly. Still dry, but with something careful underneath it. Beaumont is bringing a witness, someone from this area who will testify that you expressed doubt about the arrangement before your arrival. She went still. Who? The filing doesn't name them, it just references a witness to be called. She thought about Cord Duffy and his 3 trips to town and the well-dressed lawyer from Billings standing in Silas's barn. She looked at Silas. He was looking at his hat. I see, she said. She didn't confront Cord that day. She didn't see the point in confronting him before she knew exactly what he'd said and to whom, because confrontations without information were just noise, and noise warned people to get their stories straight. Instead, she went back to the ranch and cooked supper and helped Eli with the letters he was learning and listened to Walt describe a problem with the north fence line. And she thought. What she thought was this. Raymond Holt had come back to Ash Creek with a specific plan. He'd hired a lawyer before he returned, which meant the plan predated his return. He'd spent a week talking to people in town before approaching her on the street, which meant the approach had been designed to feel accidental. He'd found someone inside the Boone Ranch or made someone available to be found, and he'd used them. He was not a man having a legal dispute. He was a man running a process. And the process was one he'd run before, which meant somewhere in the territory there were records of it. She wrote a 4th letter that night, this one to the territorial courthouse in Billings, requesting any civil filings under the name Raymond Holt going back 5 years. She didn't know if they'd respond in time. She sent it anyway. You're not sleeping, Silas said from the doorway. It was past 10. She hadn't heard him come in. She looked up from the table and he was standing there in the kitchen doorway in his coat, which meant he'd been outside, which meant he couldn't sleep either. I'm writing letters, she said. I see that. He came in and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without asking, which she was beginning to understand was just how he moved through his own house. Not rudely, just naturally, the way a person is natural in a place they've lived long enough to own without thinking about it. Hargrove's good, he said. If the records are there, he'll find them. If, she said. Yeah. She set down her pen. Tell me about Cord. He looked at the table. Cord's been here 4 years. He's not a bad hand. He talks too much and he doesn't always think before he does it. And I think Holt found him and offered him something, and Cord took it without thinking through what he was actually doing. What did Holt offer him? I don't know exactly. Cash, probably. Cord's got a brother in Helena with debts. She considered this. Are you going to let him go? Silas was quiet for a moment. Not until after the hearing. If I let him go now, Beaumont will call him anyway, and he'll be angrier, and he'll have nothing left to protect. He paused. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. No, it's the right call. He looked at her. It feels wrong. Most right calls do. He almost smiled. She saw it almost happen and then not happen, and she looked back down at her letter. What did you tell Eli tonight? She asked. When you put him to bed. That you were busy, that you were working on something important. What did he say? He said, like Mama used to work on her letters. Silas's voice was level, but the levelness was doing work. She used to write to her sister in the evenings, after he was in bed. Adeline didn't say anything. Sometimes things don't need a response. They need a witness, someone to sit with them in the room without trying to fix them. After a moment, Silas said, He's doing better. Since you've been here, he's sleeping through the night again. He's a tough kid. He didn't used to be. Before Clara died, he laughed all the time. Just laughed at everything. After, he stopped for nearly 6 months. He looked at his hands. He laughed today, out in the yard. You probably heard it. I did, she said. Yeah, he said quietly. So did I. She sealed her letter and set it with the others and blew out the extra lamp to save oil, and the kitchen got smaller and dimmer and somehow easier. Go to sleep, Silas, she said. You first, he said, and got up and went to bed, and she sat for another 10 minutes in the dark kitchen listening to the house settle around her, and thought that whatever happened in 18 days, she was not leaving this place of her own choosing. The first letter came back on the 9th day. It was from a woman in Laramie, Wyoming, named Dorothea Vance, and it was 4 pages long in a small, careful hand. Adeline read it standing at the postal counter with Foster watching her from the corner of his eye, and she read it twice before she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and walked directly to Hargrove's office. Dorothea Vance had corresponded with Raymond Holt for 6 months, 2 years prior. He'd advertised in the same correspondence gazette Adeline had used. He'd written beautifully, practically, not poetically. He'd described a ranch in precise, unsentimental terms. He'd never mentioned a previous correspondence. He'd asked Dorothea to send money toward the cost of travel arrangements. Not much, just enough, he'd said, to hold the date. And she'd sent it, $30, because she'd trusted him. Then he'd written one more letter saying there had been a delay, he would be in touch, and she'd never heard from him again. $30. Not a fortune. Not even, on its own, a crime that anyone would bother pursuing. But $30 multiplied by however many Dorothea Vances there were added up to something different. Hargrove read the letter and set it down on his desk with the careful movement of a man resisting the urge to say, I told you so, when he hadn't, actually, told her so, but had clearly been thinking something in that direction. He asked her for money, he said. $30. Toward travel arrangements. Did he ask you for money? No, but I had less than Dorothea probably, and I think… She stopped, working through it. I think the money isn't always the point. Sometimes the money is incidental. Sometimes what he wants is the legal leverage, the threat, the settlement. Hargrove looked at her. Some women pay him to make him go away, she said. Some women he takes money from directly, before he disappears. He's running 2 different schemes from the same correspondence, depending on what each woman has and what she's likely to do. That is, Hargrove paused, that is a remarkably systematic reading. I was a school teacher for 9 years, she said. I learned to spot when a student was running a pattern. He picked up his pen. I need Dorothea Vance's statement in written form, signed, witnessed if possible. Can she provide that? I'll write to her today. We have 9 days. I know. She was at the door when Hargrove said, Miss Cross. She turned. He was looking at her over his spectacles with an expression that was the closest thing to warmth she'd seen on his face. The property records came back from Billings this morning. She waited. Holt sold his ranch on the 14th of March, Hargrove said. Your train arrived on the 19th. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and let that land. He sold it 5 days before I arrived, she said. He had no ranch when you arrived. He had no property in this territory at all. He was, in the legal sense, not a rancher in Ash Creek, but a man who had recently been one and had already arranged to be something else. He was already gone before I got here, she said. Not just physically, legally, precisely. She looked at him. Can we use that? It significantly undermines his claim that you breached an agreement with a rancher in Ash Creek, Hargrove said carefully, because the rancher in Ash Creek had, at the time of your arrival, ceased to exist. She almost laughed. It wasn't funny. Nothing about it was funny. But there was something so clean about the way the lie had exposed its own structure that she felt a flicker of something like dark satisfaction. Good, she said. Keep going. Well, on the 12th day, the second letter arrived. This one was from Nebraska, from a woman named Pauline Marsh, who had heard about Adeline's situation from the schoolteacher Adeline had written to, who had passed the letter along. Pauline had not corresponded with Holt herself, but knew a woman in her county who had, a widow named Frances Elroy, now remarried and living in Iowa, who had sent Holt $40 and received a letter 3 weeks later saying he'd had a change of heart and was very sorry. Pauline provided Frances Elroy's married name and address in Iowa. She also provided, without being asked, the name of a third woman, a cousin of a neighbor, who had written to a man matching Holt's description through a different correspondence gazette in Kansas, 2 years before Dorothea Vance. 3 women, possibly 4. Each one a discrete transaction, cleanly separated by time and state lines. Adeline brought this to Hargrove, who read it and made the sound again, the one between a sigh and a grunt, and then wrote a telegraph to the courthouse in Billings asking whether any civil filings under Raymond Holt had been made in Wyoming, Nebraska, or Kansas in the past 4 years. "Will they respond in time?" she asked. "Foster will make sure they do," Hargrove said, with the tone of a man confident in his favors. That afternoon, she was coming out of the hotel after speaking with Mrs. Parrish, who had, quietly and without fanfare, offered to attend the hearing as a character witness, saying only that she'd watched Adeline Cross walk into her hotel with $11 in a spine, and that counted for something, when she ran directly into Cord Duffy. He stopped. She stopped. For a moment, they stood on the boardwalk and looked at each other with the specific discomfort of 2 people who know what the other knows and haven't yet decided what to do about knowing it. "Miss Cross," he said. "Cord," she said. He looked at her with something that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance, but was clearly uncomfortable in the space between them. "I need you to know," he started, "that I didn't say anything that wasn't—" "What did you tell him?" she said. Not unkindly, just directly. He looked at the street. "He asked me if you'd ever said anything to Silas about not wanting to be here, about wishing you'd gone back to Ohio." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him you said once in the kitchen that Ohio felt like a different life." He looked at her. "That's all I said. That's exactly what I said." She looked at him. It was true. She had said something like that, to herself mostly, though she'd been aware Walt was in the next room. It was the kind of thing people say when they're settling into a new place and measuring the distance from the old one. It meant nothing except that Beaumont would find a way to make it mean something. "How much did he pay you?" she asked. Cord's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking to shame you," she said. "I'm asking because if Beaumont paid you to testify, and I can show that, it changes what your testimony is worth." He looked at her for a long moment. "I was 20 years old and not a bad person, and had done something he told himself was harmless, and was only now fully understanding that it wasn't." $25, he said quietly. She nodded. "Did he pay you already?" "Half. The other half after the hearing." "Cord." She waited until he looked at her. "Think carefully about what you do next. I'm not threatening you. I'm asking you to think." She walked past him. She heard him standing on the boardwalk behind her, and didn't turn around. What? On the 15th day, the response came back from the territorial courthouse in Billings. Foster brought it to Hargrove's office personally, which was unusual enough that Adeline, who happened to be there reviewing documents, knew before Hargrove opened it that it was something. Hargrove read it. He set it down. He looked at Adeline over his spectacles. 2 civil filings, he said. One in Wyoming 18 months ago. Dismissed when the plaintiff, a woman named Vance, Dorothea Vance, Adeline said, declined to pursue it after the defendant agreed to an out-of-court settlement. One in Nebraska, 9 months ago. The plaintiff in that case withdrew before the hearing. "He settled with Dorothea," she said. "She took money to make it stop." "Apparently." "And the Nebraska woman withdrew." She thought about that. "Because he threatened her, or because she couldn't afford to fight. We can't know which." "We don't need to know which," she said. "We just need the filings." Hargrove looked at her. 2 prior civil actions under the same circumstances, in adjacent territories within the past 2 years. That, Miss Cross, is a pattern. And a pattern, she said, is not a misunderstanding. He almost smiled. It lasted about as long as Silas's almost smiles, which she was beginning to think was a quality of men in this part of Montana. The smile that was there for a second and then went back to work. "The hearing is in 3 days, he said. "I'll have everything compiled. The property records, the court filings, Dorothea Vance's written statement, which arrived yesterday," she said, "witnessed by her neighbor and the Laramie postmaster, and the testimony of Mrs. Parrish, who offered without being asked, and whatever else you've managed to accumulate." He set down his pen. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plainly." She waited. "Beaumont is a capable lawyer. He will take everything I've just described and find a counter for each piece. He will argue the court filings are unrelated. He will argue the property sale was a private business decision with no bearing on personal arrangements. He will put Cord Duffy on the stand and make those 11 words sound like abandonment. He looked at her steadily. And none of that will matter as much as you do when you stand up there. Because at the end of everything, the judge is going to look at you and look at Holt and make a judgment that is not entirely about documents. You're telling me I need to be credible. I'm telling you need to be yourself, he said, specifically, because Holt is going to perform a version of himself that is practiced and polished and sympathetic. And the only thing that beats that is someone who is exactly what they appear to be and doesn't need to perform anything. She thought about this. I've spent 9 years teaching children who tried to convince me of things that weren't true, she said. I know what performing looks like. Yes, Hargrove said, but you'll be standing in front of a judge, not a classroom. Same thing, she said, just taller chairs. He looked at her for a moment and then made a sound that was, definitively, a laugh. Brief and dry and quickly suppressed, like a man who'd surprised himself. 3 days, he said. Go get some sleep. That night, Adeline sat on the porch of the Boone Ranch house in the cold and looked at the sky, which was clear and full of stars, in the particular extravagant way that Montana skies are clear and full of stars. Not subtle about it, not restrained, just fully committed to being enormous. She had her coat on and her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, and she was not thinking about the hearing. She was just sitting with the cold and the sky and the specific smell of the ranch at night, hay and horses and wood smoke, and the faint mineral smell of the creek somewhere east. The door opened behind her. Eli came out in his nightshirt and socks, which meant he'd gotten out of bed again, which meant he'd heard something or sensed something or was just Eli, who had the instinct of a small animal for knowing when someone he cared about was sitting alone outside. You'll freeze, she said. He came and stood beside her chair. She pulled him under her coat, which he accepted without comment, pressing into her side with that solid, compact warmth that small children have. Are you scared? He asked. About the hearing? Yeah. She thought about lying and decided against it. A little. Papa's scared too, Eli said. He doesn't say so, but he gets quiet in a different way than his regular quiet. She looked down at the top of his head. When did you get so smart? Mama said I got it from her side, he said, matter-of-factly, without grief. Just information. She was right, Adeline said. He leaned into her more heavily, the way he did when he was getting close to sleep. You know what I think? He said. What? I think that man doesn't know you very well. His voice was getting drowsy, the words softening at the edges. If he did, he wouldn't have picked a fight with you. She sat with that for a moment. Go inside, Eli, she said softly. I mean it. He went slowly, dragging his sock feet on the porch boards, and the door opened and closed, and she was alone again with the cold and the enormous sky. She finished her cold coffee and went inside and lay down in her room with the morning light, and closed her eyes and thought, 3 days. She had fought for nothing her whole life that she hadn't believed was worth fighting for. She had left Ohio for a reason, and the reason wasn't Raymond Holt. It was never Raymond Holt. It was the belief, held stubbornly through 31 years of being careful and controlled and self-sufficient, that somewhere there was a life that was exactly the size of the one she was capable of living. She was already in it. That was the thing she hadn't expected. Not the hearing, not the fight, not even the ranch or the boy, or the quiet man who drove 8 miles and stood in a hotel hallway and said, I know that. That's why I knocked. She was already in the life. And Raymond Holt, with his polished lawyer and his paid witness and his practiced sympathetic expression, was not going to take it from her. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she went to sleep before midnight. The morning of the hearing, Adeline woke before 4 and lay in the dark for 20 minutes before accepting that sleep was finished with her. She dressed by lamplight in the best thing she owned. A dark wool dress, practical but clean, with a collar she'd ironed the night before twice because the first time hadn't satisfied her. And she braided her hair the way she always did, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and thought, this is what you are. This is enough. She went downstairs and found Silas already in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table with his coffee, still in his work clothes, which meant he hadn't slept either or had gotten up early enough that the distinction didn't matter. He looked up when she came in and looked back down at his coffee without saying anything, And she went to the stove and poured herself a cup and sat across from him, and they drank in silence for a few minutes, which was, she had come to understand, one of the more honest things about living in this house. "Walt's going to bring Eli in later," he said. "After." "He doesn't need to be there," she said. "I know. Walt'll take him to the dry goods store. Let him pick something." He turned his cup on the table. "Eli asked me this morning if you were going to win." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were going to tell the truth, and let that be enough." She looked at him. "Did he accept that?" "No," Silas said. "He said that wasn't what he asked." She almost smiled. "What did you say then?" "I said yes." He looked at her steadily. "I told him yes." She held that for a moment. Outside, the ranch was still dark and the horses were quiet, and the world hadn't started yet, and she felt the particular weight of a day that is going to matter pressing down on the morning. "Silas," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Not for any of it. I didn't do it to be thanked." She looked at him. I was looking at his coffee again. "All right," she said. "I won't." They left at 6:30 and drove the 8 miles in the gray early light without talking much, which suited both of them. The hearing was held in the largest room Ash Creek had available for civic purposes, which was the back room of the Cattlemen's Association Hall, a space normally used for land disputes and town meetings, and twice a year something that called itself a dance. It had rows of wooden chairs that someone had arranged in approximation of a courtroom, a long table at the front where the judge would sit, and a small elevated platform with a chair where witnesses would stand to testify. By 8 o'clock in the morning, every chair was filled. Adeline had not expected that. She knew people would come. Small towns always came to things like this because small towns ran on information, and a public hearing was information freely given. But she hadn't expected every chair, hadn't expected people standing along the back wall, hadn't expected to walk in with Silas and feel the particular weight of a room that has been waiting for you. Hargrove was already at the plaintiff's table, or what served as one, with his documents arranged in the careful, hierarchical way that Adeline had come to associate with his working mind. He looked at her when she sat down beside him and gave her a brief nod that communicated, "Ready, prepared, as good as we can be." Across the room, at the opposing table, Beaumont sat with Raymond Holt beside him. Beaumont was everything she remembered from the brief glimpse in the barn. Deliberate, well-dressed, the particular stillness of a lawyer who has done this many times and knows how to manage the distance between himself and the facts he's working with. Holt sat beside him in a good coat, his posture the posture of a man who is comfortable being looked at. He caught her eye across the room and gave her the sympathetic expression, the one she'd seen on the street, the one that said, "I regret what must be done." And she held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds and then looked away. Not because she was intimidated, but because she was done letting him decide when the looking started and stopped. The judge arrived at 8:15. His name was Calloway, circuit judge out of Billings, and he was 60-something with the manner of a man who has presided over enough human foolishness to be immune to surprise, but not to irritation. He sat down, looked at the room, looked at his papers, and said, "We're here on a civil matter, Holt versus Cross. Breach of promise claim. Let's proceed." Beaumont opened first. He was good. Adeline had expected him to be good and still found herself noting how good, the way you note a thing even when you've prepared for it. He spoke in the measured, reasonable tones of a man who is simply helping the court understand a sad situation. 2 people, a correspondence, an agreement entered in good faith, a woman who had changed her mind and left a good man with nothing but broken expectations and incurred costs. He used the word unfortunate 4 times in 8 minutes. He was careful never to call Adeline dishonest. He didn't need to. The narrative did the work. He called his first witness, not Cord Duffy, a man named Aldis from the feed store, who testified that he had spoken with Holt when Holt returned to Ash Creek, and that Holt had seemed, in Aldis's words, deeply saddened by how things had turned out. Hargrove stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Aldis, did Mr. Holt tell you specifically what 'how things had turned out' referred to?" "Well, he said, 'Yes or no, please.'" "No." "Did Mr. Holt mention that he had sold his ranch in this territory 5 days before Miss Cross's train arrived?" Aldis blinked. "No." "Thank you." Beaumont's second witness was a woman named Mrs. Garfield, who ran a boarding house on the south end of Ash Creek, and who testified, with evident feeling, that a woman who traveled all that way and then decided not to marry ought to at least have the decency to compensate a man for his time. Hargrove did not cross-examine her. He simply let the judge look at the witness, and the witness look at the judge, and the moment passed. Then Beaumont called Cord Duffy. Cord walked to the witness chair with the specific walk of a person who is regretting something in real time, but is committed too far to stop. He sat down. He looked at his hands. Beaumont asked him, in a gentle and sympathetic voice, whether he had heard Miss Cross express doubt about remaining in Ash Creek, and Cord said yes, and Beaumont asked him to describe the circumstances. And Cord described the kitchen, the evening, the words, "Ohio feels like a different life," with reasonable accuracy. Then Hargrove stood up. "Mr. Duffy," he said, "how long have you worked at the Boone Ranch?" 4 years? "And in that time have you found Mr. Boone to be an honest employer?" "Yes." "Have you found Miss Cross, in the time she has been employed at the Boone Ranch, to be a person of honest character?" Cord looked at his hands. "Yes." "Mr. Duffy, did you receive payment from Mr. Holt or his representatives in exchange for your testimony today?" The room changed temperature. Adeline felt it, not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, but in the small, real way that a room full of people shifts when something they weren't expecting enters the air. Beaumont was on his feet. "Objection! I'll allow it," Judge Calloway said, without looking up from his notes. "Witness will answer." Cord was looking at a point somewhere above Hargrove's head. "Mr. Duffy," Hargrove said again, quietly. "1250, Cord said. His voice was low enough that Calloway asked him to repeat it, and he did. 1250, half of 25. The room did not erupt. It was quieter than that, the quiet of people reassessing what they thought they'd understood. "Thank you," Hargrove said. "No further questions." Beaumont recovered smoothly because Beaumont was a professional and professionals recover. He moved on to documentary evidence, the letters, the correspondence, the one letter from Adeline that Holt claimed stated she had doubts, though he could not produce the letter itself, only his own testimony of its contents. Hargrove objected. Calloway sustained. Beaumont presented what he could and built the best case available to him with the materials he had, and it was decent work, and under other circumstances it might have been enough. Then Hargrove stood up and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to present several items of evidence." He began with the property record. He didn't present it dramatically. He simply placed it before the judge and said, "This is the official territorial property record for the ranch at Ash Creek previously owned by Raymond Holt. It shows the property was transferred, sold, on the 14th of March of this year. Miss Cross's train arrived on the 19th of March. Mr. Holt did not own the property he described to Miss Cross at the time of her arrival. He had, in fact, liquidated it." Calloway looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. "Mr. Beaumont," he said, "were you aware of this?" Beaumont's composure held. "The property sale is a separate matter from—" "I didn't ask whether it was a separate matter. I asked if you were aware of it." A pause. "Yes, Your Honor." "Continue, Mr. Hargrove." Hargrove placed the territorial court filings next. Wyoming, 18 months prior. Nebraska, 9 months prior. He stated the case numbers, the dates, the names of the plaintiffs, and the outcomes. He did not editorialize. He let the documents speak in the dry, patient voice that documents speak in when they've been waiting for their moment. 2 prior civil actions under similar circumstances, he said. In each case, the complainant was a woman who had entered a correspondence with Mr. Holt regarding marriage, had invested time and, in at least one case, financial resources, and had subsequently been either abandoned or threatened with legal action. In one case, Mr. Holt accepted a settlement. In the other, the complainant withdrew. In both cases, no finding was made against him, but the pattern of conduct is documented. "Objection," Beaumont said. "Prior proceedings are not evidence of conduct in this matter." "They're not being entered as evidence of a crime," Hargrove said steadily. "They're being entered as context for the court's assessment of Mr. Holt's characterization of this as an isolated and unfortunate misunderstanding." Calloway looked at Beaumont. Beaumont looked at the table. "I'll consider them," Calloway said. "Continue." Hargrove placed Dorothea Vance's written statement before the court. He read the relevant portions. Not the whole thing, just the specific facts. The correspondence, the request for $30, the disappearance. The settlement she'd accepted because she couldn't afford to fight and couldn't afford the shame of it going further. Her own words, witnessed and signed. I want any woman in a similar situation to know she is not the only one, and she is not at fault. When Hargrove finished reading that line, the room was very quiet. Then he said, Your Honor, I'd like to call Miss Adeline Cross. She had thought about this moment many times in 3 weeks, and in each version of it she had imagined herself feeling something specific, afraid, or resolved, or calm. What she actually felt, walking to the witness chair, was tired. Not the collapsing kind of tired, but the kind that comes after you've been carrying something a long distance and are finally close enough to put it down. She sat in the chair and looked at the room. Every face she had come to know in Ash Creek was there. Mrs. Parrish, who had given her the room with morning light. Mrs. Dewey from the dry goods store, who had looked at her like a warning and was now looking at her like something harder to define. The station master Gill, who had waited an hour before walking over. Walt, who had shown up without being asked, in the back row, arms crossed, face doing nothing at all. And Silas, at the table, looking at her with the steady, undemonstrative attention he gave to things that mattered to him. She did not look at Holt. Hargrove asked her to describe, in her own words, the correspondence with Raymond Holt, the decision to travel, the arrival, and the events since. She did. She was precise, and she was not dramatic, and she did not perform anything. She said what happened in the order it happened, including the parts that did not reflect well on her judgment. The trust she'd extended, the questions she hadn't asked, the letters she'd never thought to keep a copy of. She said it all plainly because Hargrove had told her that plain was the thing, and because she'd known that already, and because she had nothing to hide and hiding was exhausting, and she was done with it. Then Beaumont cross-examined her. I was careful, and he was skilled, and he asked his questions in a register of gentle skepticism, designed to make her seem like a woman constructing a story rather than remembering one. He asked about her financial situation in Ohio. He asked about the condition of the Boone Ranch when she arrived and what arrangement she had with Silas. He asked, with careful neutrality, whether she had developed personal feelings for Mr. Boone that might color her account of events. She looked at him steadily. I work for Mr. Boone, she said. He employed me when I had few options. I'm grateful for that. My feelings about Mr. Boone have no bearing on what Raymond Holt wrote to me for 8 months, what he promised me, or what he did when my train pulled into Ash Creek. And yet you chose to stay in Ash Creek, Beaumont said, rather than return to Ohio. Yes. Why? She looked at him. Because leaving would have meant accepting a version of events that wasn't true. And I don't accept things that aren't true just because accepting them is easier. Beaumont moved on. He asked about the specific evening Cord had described, the kitchen, the comment about Ohio. She confirmed it. She did not dispute Cord's account of the words. She said, Yes, I said that Ohio feels like a different life. It does. That is not the same as saying I wish to return to it. It is not the same as withdrawal from any arrangement. It is what you say when you are settling into something new and you are thinking about how far you've come. Beaumont tried one more angle. Miss Cross, isn't it possible that Mr. Holt's departure was prompted by a genuine belief that you had withdrawn based on a letter he received? He sold his ranch on the 14th of March, she said. My train arrived on the 19th. If he had received a letter prompting his departure, he received it before the 14th. I have every letter he sent me through mid-March. Not one of them indicates he had any doubt about the arrangement. She paused. The only thing that had changed by the 14th of March was that he had found a buyer for his ranch. Beaumont looked at her. She looked back. No further questions, he said. Hargrove called Mrs. Parrish last. She sat in the witness chair with her hands in her lap and answered questions in the same tone she used to discuss room rates, factual, unhurried, indifferent to what anyone thought about what she was saying. I've run that hotel for 19 years, she said. I've seen women come through this town in every kind of situation you can imagine. Miss Cross walked into my hotel with $11, no connections, and no prospects, and she was the straightest-backed woman I'd seen in a decade. She paid what she owed, she didn't complain, and she asked for work before she asked for anything else. She looked at the judge. I don't know what kind of woman Mr. Holt was expecting, but I know what kind of woman showed up. And I know the difference between someone running from something and someone standing their ground. Beaumont did not cross-examine her. Calloway took a 15-minute recess. The room talked in low voices. Adeline sat at the table and Hargrove shuffled his papers, and Silas brought her a cup of water from somewhere and set it in front of her without comment, and she drank it. "How do you think it went?" she asked Hargrove quietly. "The property record was the thing," he said. "Everything else builds the picture, but the property record is the floor. You can't claim you were abandoned by a woman when you'd already sold the house before she arrived." She nodded. She looked at her hands on the table. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know that I didn't fight this because I thought I'd win. I fought it because it was true." Hargrove looked at her over his spectacles. "In my experience," he said, "those two things are more connected than people think." Calloway came back and the room settled and the judge opened his notes and looked at them for a moment without speaking, the way judges do when they have already made up their mind but want the room to understand that the decision was not hasty. Then he looked up. "I've reviewed the documentary evidence and heard the testimony in this matter," he said. "I'll be direct. The claim before this court is that Miss Adeline Cross breached a marriage agreement with the plaintiff, causing him emotional and financial harm. The plaintiff has provided testimony of the correspondence in the agreement. He has provided a witness who heard the defendant express sentiments about her home state, which the court does not find constitutes withdrawal from any arrangement. He has not provided the letter he claims to have received indicating withdrawal. He has not provided evidence of financial expenditure on behalf of this arrangement, and he has not explained, to the court's satisfaction, why he liquidated his property in this territory 5 days before the defendant's arrival if he expected her to arrive and fulfill an agreement." The room was absolutely still. "The defense has provided property records documenting the sale of the plaintiff's ranch prior to the defendant's arrival. The defense has provided evidence of 2 prior civil actions in adjacent territories under substantially similar circumstances, indicating that this is not, as the plaintiff's counsel characterized it, an isolated misunderstanding. The defense has provided a signed written statement from one of those prior complainants describing a pattern of conduct that this court finds troubling." Calloway set down his notes. "The court finds no breach of promise on the part of the defendant. The claim is dismissed." Beaumont was already opening his mouth. Calloway held up one hand. "Furthermore," the judge said, and his voice changed. Not louder, just harder, the way a man's voice changes when he is done with the procedural portion of what he has to say and is now saying the part that is personal. "This court wants the record to reflect that the evidence presented today suggests a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation directed at women seeking legitimate arrangements. This court has no jurisdiction over proceedings in Wyoming or Nebraska. But I'm making a formal notation in the territorial record of this hearing, including the prior civil actions and the documentary evidence submitted, and I am recommending that the Territorial Prosecutor's Office review the record for any action they see fit to take." He looked at Holt directly. "Mr. Holt," he said, "you walked into this courtroom confident that a woman with no social standing and limited resources would be unable to mount an effective defense. You were wrong about what she had, and you were wrong about who she is. I suggest you use the time between now and whenever the territorial prosecutor contacts you to think carefully about that." He stood. "Court is adjourned." The room came back to life all at once, the way rooms do when a held breath releases. Adeline sat for a moment without moving. Hargrove was already gathering his documents with the efficient movements of a man who has just done something he's pleased with, but is too professional to show it. Silas was beside her, and she wasn't sure when he'd gotten there. At some point, he had simply moved from the table to standing next to her, the way he moved through his house, naturally, without announcing it. "Adeline," he said. She looked up at him. He had the look, the one she still didn't have a clean word for, except that she was beginning to think the word was something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. "Yeah," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Yeah," he said back, which meant about 4 different things at once. Across the room, Raymond Holt was speaking quietly with Beaumont, his back to the court, and she looked at him one final time. The good coat, the careful grooming, the managed distance between himself and everything he actually was, and felt nothing in particular. Not triumph, not relief, just the specific absence of something that had been sitting on her chest for 3 weeks and was now, finally, not there anymore. Mrs. Parrish appeared at her elbow. She did not hug Adeline or say anything congratulatory. She said, "Your room's available through the end of the week if you need it. $1.50 a night, meals included. I don't need it, Adeline said, but thank you. Mrs. Parrish nodded once and walked away, which was, Adeline understood, the warmest thing the woman knew how to do. Then she heard the door at the back of the room and turned, and Walt was there. And beside Walt was Eli, who had apparently convinced Walt that the dry goods store could wait, and who now stood at the back of the room scanning it with those dark eyes until he found her. And when he found her, his whole face changed. Not to relief or excitement, but to something more fundamental, the expression of a child who needed to know where someone was, and now knows. She raised her hand. He waved back. She gathered her coat from the chair and picked up her hat and thought about an empty train platform and a mud-streaked boardwalk, and a boy in a nightshirt who smelled something familiar in a stranger and decided that was enough to go on. She walked toward the back of the room and didn't look back at the table where Raymond Holt sat, because there was nothing there she needed to see again. Eli met her halfway. "Did you win?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I knew it," he said, with the absolute confidence of someone who had simply been waiting for the world to confirm what he already understood. She put her hand on top of his head, and they walked out into the cold Montana air, and behind her she heard Silas's boots on the wooden floor, steady and unhurried, following. The ride back from Ash Creek that afternoon was different from every ride before it. Not because anything dramatic had changed in the 8 miles of ruts and frozen mud between town and the ranch. The cottonwoods still leaned at the creek bend. The wind still came sideways at the same stretch of road. The sky was still the wide, unsubtle Montana sky that didn't ask permission to be enormous. But Adeline sat on the buckboard with Eli pressed against her side, and Silas driving and Walt following behind on his horse. And the silence between them had a different texture than the silences before. The silences before had been the silence of people managing something. This was the silence of people who had gotten to the other side of it and didn't yet know what to do with their hands now that they weren't gripping anything. Eli fell asleep against her shoulder somewhere around mile 5. He'd been awake since before 4 in the morning, running on the particular adrenaline of a child who knows something important is happening and refuses to miss it, and now the adrenaline was gone, and he was simply a small, heavy, sleeping boy leaning into her arm at an angle that was going to make her shoulder ache, and she didn't move him. Silas glanced over once, looked at his son sleeping, looked at the road. "He did that with Clara," he said quietly, "on long rides. Just went out like a lamp." "He's a good sleeper when he's not worried," she said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't been a good sleeper in a while. Until recent." She didn't answer because the answer was obvious, and saying it out loud felt like too much for a buckboard on a dirt road with the afternoon light going gray. They got back to the ranch, and Walt took the horse, and Silas carried Eli inside without waking him, which was a feat that required a particular kind of practiced care. The kind of thing a man learns not by being taught, but by doing it hundreds of times until his body knows the angles. She watched him carry his son up the stairs and felt the ache in her shoulder from where the boy's weight had been and thought about things she was not ready to think about directly. So she went to the kitchen and started supper. That was the thing about hard days. They ended, and then you still had to feed people. 2 days after the hearing, Cord Duffy knocked on the kitchen door. Adeline opened it, and he stood on the step with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has been working himself up to something for 48 hours and has finally arrived. "Miss Cross," he said. "Cord." He looked at his hat. "I owe you an apology." "You do," she said. He nodded, still looking at his hat. "I told myself it was just a few words, that it wouldn't matter much, that he'd probably just use it to negotiate something and it'd be over and nobody'd get hurt." He looked up. "I was wrong about all of that." She looked at him. He was 20 years old, and he had done something stupid for money his brother needed, and he had sat in a courtroom and told the truth about the $25 when a different kind of person would have lied, and those things together made a picture that was more complicated than either innocent or guilty. "I know you were," she said. "Come in. There's coffee." He blinked. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. Come in." He came in and sat at the kitchen table, and she poured him coffee and stood at the counter and said, "Why did you tell the truth? On the stand. You could have held to the story. $12.50 was already in your pocket." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Because Hargrove asked me straight, and I looked at you sitting there, and I thought about—" He stopped. My mother. She came out here from Kentucky after my father died. She didn't know anybody. She had me and Pete and about $30, and she worked. She worked herself half to death for about 4 years before things got decent. He looked at his coffee. I looked at you and I thought about her sitting in that chair, and I couldn't do it. Adeline stood with that for a moment. How's your brother's situation? She said. Still bad. Better than it was. Getting there. You're a good brother, she said. That doesn't excuse the thing you did, but it explains it. Those are different. He looked at her. Silas know I came to apologize? Not yet. Is he going to let me go? She thought about what Silas had said the night they'd discussed it. If I let him go now, Cord's angrier, and he has nothing left to protect. That logic had applied before the hearing. After was different, but it wasn't her decision to make. Talk to Silas, she said. He's fair. Whatever he decides, it'll be fair. Cord nodded and finished his coffee and took his hat and went to find Silas. She watched him cross the yard from the kitchen window and thought about her mother, coming out here from Kentucky with $30 and 2 boys, and the way hard circumstances sometimes make the most honest revelations about what a person is actually made of. She didn't find out until supper that Silas had told Cord he could stay through the end of calving season, which was 3 months, which was Silas's version of, I see what you did wrong, and I see why you told the truth, and I'm going to let those two things balance. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something more practical than forgiveness and possibly more useful. A week after the hearing, a letter came from the territorial prosecutor's office in Billings. Hargrove sent it out to the ranch by way of Foster, the telegraph clerk, who made the ride himself, which told her before she opened it that the contents were significant. The letter informed Miss Adeline Cross that the territorial prosecutor had reviewed Judge Calloway's notation and the evidence submitted at the hearing, and had opened a formal investigation into Raymond Holt's conduct across 3 territories. Miss Cross was not required to take any further action at this time, but might be contacted for a statement. The prosecutor wished to note that her diligence in gathering documentary evidence had provided a foundation the investigation would not otherwise have had. She read it twice at the kitchen table and then folded it and put it in the box where she kept important papers and went back to the bread she'd been making when Foster arrived, because the bread wasn't going to make itself, and the investigation was in other people's hands now, which was where it belonged. Silas read the letter that evening. He set it down on the table and said nothing for a moment. Dorothea Vance, he said finally. The woman in Wyoming. She settled with him, took his money to make it stop. Yes. She might get something back. Maybe, if they find enough. He looked at the letter. You did that. The letter you wrote her. She did, Adeline said. She wrote back. She signed the statement. I just gave her the address. That's not nothing, he said. No, she said. It's not. She took the letter back and put it away, and that was, functionally, the end of Raymond Holt in her daily life. He left Ash Creek sometime in the week after the hearing. Nobody saw him go, which was fitting, given that nobody had seen him leave the first time. He was simply there and then not there, and the space he'd occupied in the town's conversation closed over behind him, the way water closes over a thrown stone, until the surface was smooth again and you'd never know anything had broken it. She did not feel triumphant about his absence. She felt, mostly, the absence of a weight. That was enough. The thing about frontier life that nobody told you before you arrived was that it didn't pause for your interior weather. The ranch needed working whether you were in the middle of a legal fight or not, and now that the fight was over, it still needed working, and calving season arrived in early April with all the chaos and exhaustion and occasional horror that calving season brings to a cattle ranch. Animals in distress at 2 a.m, Silas out in the cold for 36 hours straight, Walt's face set in the particular grimness of a man managing a crisis he's managed before and knows doesn't get easier just because you've done it before. Adeline learned things she had not expected to learn. She learned that a calf that won't nurse needs to be taught with more patience than a classroom of 8-year-olds. She learned that when Silas came in at 3 a.m. after a difficult birth and sat down at the kitchen table with mud on everything, and the particular hollow look of someone running on nothing, what he needed was not conversation, but food and warmth and someone present, and so she got up and made eggs and coffee and sat across from him while he ate, and neither of them said anything, and it was all right. She learned that Pete Duffy, the younger of the two brothers, could not make a decent cup of coffee to save his life, but was genuinely gifted with horses in a way that went beyond skill into something closer to language. A wordless exchange between a man and an animal that she found unexpectedly moving to watch. She learned that Walt, who had initially looked at her with the wariness of a man protecting something fragile, had at some point made a private decision about her and now expressed this decision by leaving the hardest kindling stacked nearest the kitchen door and never commenting on it. She learned that Eli had a talent for drawing that neither she nor Silas had known about until she gave him paper and a pencil one rainy afternoon to keep him occupied, and he produced in 30 minutes a recognizable likeness of the barn that stopped her cold. "Eli," she said, "did you know you could do this?" He looked at the drawing. "I draw things sometimes, in the dirt." "Why didn't you say something?" He shrugged with the absolute economy of small boy expression. "Nobody asked." She went to town the following week and came back with a proper drawing pad and 3 good pencils, which cost more than she'd intended to spend, and when she gave them to Eli, he looked at them for a long moment with the expression of a child receiving something he hadn't known he was allowed to want. "Thank you," he said, quietly and with complete seriousness. "Thank yourself," she said. "I just bought the paper. You put something on it." She told Silas about the drawing that evening, and he went and looked at the pad where Eli had already covered 4 pages, and he stood looking at them for a long time, with the particular stillness of a man encountering something unexpected about someone he thought he knew completely. "He got that from Clara," he said. "She used to sketch things. I forgot." He closed the pad carefully. "I forgot she did that." He stood there another moment, and then he set the pad back where it had been and went to check on something in the barn, and she let him go because some things needed the barn and the dark and the horses standing warm and breathing, and she had learned by now which moments those were. By May, the calving was done, and the ranch had settled into the rhythms of late spring, the fence lines that needed checking, the cattle that needed moving to better grazing, the work that doesn't stop but changes character with the season, from urgent to steady. Eli turned 6 on the 14th of May, and Adeline made a cake that was lopsided on one side because the stove ran hot on the left and she'd miscalculated, and Eli declared it the best cake he'd ever had, which was either sincere or deeply diplomatic, and she chose to believe it was both. Walt brought him a pocket knife with a handle made from bone, which was both practical and an unambiguous statement about how Walt saw the boy's future. Pete Duffy taught him how to whistle that afternoon, a lesson that produced 45 minutes of enthusiastic noise and one actual whistle at the very end that Eli repeated 17 times in a row to verify it worked. Silas gave his son a drawing of the ranch. Not a photograph. He'd done it himself, in pencil, rough and imperfect, the proportions slightly off in the way of a man who knows what he's looking at, but doesn't have the technical training to translate it perfectly, and that imperfection was what made it right. He'd drawn the house and the barn and the fence lines and 2 small figures in the yard, one taller, one small, and he'd written at the bottom, in his careful, unpracticed hand, "Home, May 1889. Eli looked at it for a long time and then looked at his father and said, "That's me and Adeline." Silas looked at the drawing. "Yeah," he said. "Where are you?" "Drawing it," Silas said. Eli considered this. "Oh." He looked at the drawing again. "That's good. You have to see it to draw it right." Adeline was across the room and pretended she hadn't heard this because the alternative was crying at a 6-year-old's birthday party, and she had more dignity than that. Barely. It was late June when Silas said what he'd been not saying for months. She knew it was coming, not the words specifically, but the shape of them, the way you know a change in weather before it arrives. It was in the way he'd started looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching, and the way he'd stopped looking away when she was. It was in the small accumulated evidence of a man who has been making decisions about someone without announcing them. The way he'd started leaving the kitchen lamp on when she was up late. The way he'd found reasons to be near the house in the evenings instead of in the barn. The way he'd started asking her opinion about the ranch. Not just the household, but the actual operation, the cattle, the fences, the plan for next year, as though her answers mattered to decisions he was going to make regardless. She'd been aware of all of it. She'd been aware of her own awareness of it, which was its own kind of information. He found her in the yard on a June evening when the light was still good at 7 o'clock, and the air smelled like grass and the creek, and the particular clean smell of a Montana spring finally fully arrived. She was hanging laundry, one of the tasks she'd discovered she didn't mind, something meditative about it. The repetition, the practical satisfaction of cloth going from wet to dry because of nothing more complicated than air and light. He came and stood near her and didn't say anything for a moment, which was normal, and then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say something." She kept hanging laundry. "How long have you been trying?" "About 3 months." "That's a long time." "Yeah," he said, "I'm not fast at this." She clipped a shirt to the line and reached for the next thing. "Take your time." He looked at the fence line across the yard. "When Clara died, I thought that was the shape of my life from then on. Me and Eli and the ranch and Walt, and that would be enough because it had to be enough. And it was. It was enough." He stopped. "And then you walked off a train platform and sat down in the mud with my son, and something shifted, and I've been trying to figure out whether that's real or whether it's just the circumstance," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah. I've been asking myself the same thing," she said. She put down the laundry and turned to face him properly, because this was the kind of conversation that deserved to be faced. Whether I'm here because I have nowhere better to be. Whether Eli is the thing, or whether it's more than Eli. "Is it?" he said, straight out, no softening. She looked at him, the weather-worked face, the careful eyes, the man who had stood in a hotel hallway and said, "I know that. That's why I knocked." The man who carved a wooden bird for his dying wife and left it on the windowsill where no one moved it. The man who was not easy or simple or uncomplicated, but was honest, which was the thing she'd been looking for under all the other things she'd told herself she was looking for. "Yes," she said. "It's more than Eli." He let out a breath that had been held for approximately 3 months. "I'm not good at," he started. "I know," she said. "Neither am I. I was careful for 9 years and careful got me here, so clearly careful isn't the whole answer." He almost smiled. The almost smile happened and then, for once, kept going, turned into an actual smile, small and real and not performing anything. It changed his face entirely, not into someone younger, exactly, but into someone less defended, which was different and better. "Adeline," he said. "Yes." "I don't have a speech." "Good," she said. "I don't want a speech. I want to know what you actually think." "What I actually think," he said, "is that I don't know what I did to deserve the specific coincidence that put you on that train. I don't know, and I can't explain it, and I've stopped trying. What I know is that this ranch is different with you in it. Eli is different. He stopped. "I'm different." She looked at him. "And I'd like," he said carefully, "to know if you'd consider making that permanent." She turned back to the laundry because she needed a second, and the laundry was there. She picked up a shirt and held it, and looked at it, and thought about Ohio, about the lamp she'd left behind, about the brooch, about a train platform, and a mud-streaked boy, and a man who arrived with his hat in his hands and an offer of honest work and no pity. She thought about how she'd imagined this moment would feel if it ever came, triumphant, maybe, or certain, or at minimum resolved. It didn't feel like any of those things. It felt like standing at the edge of something large and finding, to her surprise, that she wasn't afraid of the drop. "Ask me properly," she said. He was quiet for a beat. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not with the formal, ornate architecture of a question performing itself, just the words, in his voice, with the weight of a man who means them completely and is aware of what it costs to say them out loud. "Yes," she said. "I will." He reached out and took the shirt from her hands and hung it on the line himself, crooked, one side lower than the other, and she looked at the crooked shirt and said nothing because fixing it could wait until later. Chat. They married in late July, on a Saturday, in the yard of the Boone Ranch, with the cottonwoods showing their summer green and the sky doing its usual enormous thing overhead. Hargrove came out from town, which surprised her. Walt stood at the front in his good shirt, which still had a stain from calving season that hadn't entirely come out, and his expression managed, for approximately 5 minutes, to be something other than neutral. Mrs. Parrish came, saying only that she'd closed the hotel for the morning because she felt like it. The Duffy brothers came, Pete still trying to grow his mustache with continued mixed results, and Mrs. Dewey from the dry goods store came and did not say anything pointed to anyone, which was its own kind of growth. The ceremony was short because neither Adeline nor Silas had ever seen the point and length for its own sake. What mattered was what was true, and what was true didn't require embellishment. Eli stood beside Silas in a shirt that Adeline had pressed that morning, and he held the rings with the focused seriousness of someone who has been given an important job and intends to do it correctly. When the moment came and he produced them, he held them out on his palm and looked up at Adeline with those dark eyes. "Does this mean you stay now?" he asked. Not whispering, just asking, in the direct way of children who have learned that some questions are too important to soften. The yard went quiet. She looked down at him and thought about the promise she'd made him on the porch steps when he'd asked if she was scared. "I'll tell you the truth. If something changes, I'll tell you before it happens." She had kept that promise. She intended to keep this one. "Yes," she said. "This means I stay." He nodded once, satisfied, and held out the rings, and the ceremony continued, and the July sky held its blue above all of them, and somewhere off in the direction of the barn, a horse made a comment about something that nobody paid attention to. Afterward, there was food and conversation, and Eli showed Hargrove his drawing pad, which Hargrove examined with the focused attention of a man reviewing evidence, seriously, specifically, turning each page with deliberate care, and told Eli that he had a precise eye, which Eli repeated to Walt 15 minutes later with enormous satisfaction. Walt said, which was Walt's way of agreeing. Mrs. Dewey pulled Adeline aside near the end of the afternoon and said, "I wasn't kind to you when you first arrived." "No," Adeline said. "I watched what you did, in the weeks after, and in that courtroom." She looked at Adeline with the particular directness of a woman who has been in a small town long enough to have stopped being careful about what she says. "I should have offered to help sooner." "Yes," Adeline said. "You should have." Mrs. Dewey looked at her. "You're not going to say it's all right." "It is all right. But you didn't ask me if it was all right. You said you should have offered to help sooner, and you're right. You should have." She looked at the older woman steadily. "We're square." Mrs. Dewey looked at her for a moment and then did something Adeline had never seen her do. She smiled fully, without reservation, and it made her look like a completely different person. "You'll do fine here," she said. "You already are." By August, the ranch had a rhythm that included her so completely that she could no longer locate the join, the place where Adeline Cross had been added to the Boone Ranch, and everything had shifted to accommodate her. It had stopped feeling like accommodation and started feeling like fact. The household she'd rebuilt piece by piece was simply the household. The boy she'd sat with in mud outside the livery was simply her boy, not in a way that erased anything that came before, not in a way that tried to replace what Eli had lost, but in the true, imperfect, daily way of people who choose each other and then keep choosing each other in the ordinary moments that don't feel like choices but are. She wrote to Dorothea Vance in Laramie. She told her the investigation was ongoing, that the prosecutor's office had been in contact, that there were other women, and the picture was larger than either of them had known. She told her, plainly and without sentiment, that she was glad Dorothea had written back, that the 4 pages in that small, careful hand had mattered more than Dorothea probably knew. Dorothea wrote back in September. The investigation had contacted her, she said. She was cooperating. She'd been scared to at first, but then she'd thought about the $30 and about the way she'd felt when she'd cashed his settlement check. Not relieved, as she'd expected, but ashamed, and she'd carried that shame for 18 months and was tired of it. She wanted it back, she said. Not the money. The part of herself she'd given away when she'd decided it was safer to disappear than to stand. Adeline read this letter at the kitchen table on a September morning with the first cold coming back into the air, and Eli eating breakfast beside her, and Silas coming in from the barn with mud on his boots and Walt behind him arguing about the fence post situation in a way that suggested the fence post situation had a history. She folded the letter and put it with her papers and looked at the kitchen. The clean, functional kitchen, the repaired curtain hardware visible through the doorway to the hall, the wooden bird on the parlor window sill that nobody moved, and thought about what Dorothea Vance wanted back. The part of herself she'd given away when she'd decided it was safer to disappear than to stand. Adeline understood that. She'd been close to it herself. Not on the train platform, not even in the hotel with $11, but somewhere in the days before she'd written the letters, before she'd gone to Hargrove, before she'd decided that the truth was worth the cost of pursuing it. She'd been close to the edge of just letting it be, of accepting the version of events where she was the cautionary tale, and Raymond Holt was the misunderstood man, and Ash Creek was just a place she'd passed through on the way back to a smaller life. She hadn't stepped off that edge, but she'd been close enough to feel it under her feet, and she didn't think she would ever forget what that felt like. The particular pull of the easier story, the one where you disappear quietly and call it survival. The difference, she thought, between surviving and living was whether you took yourself with you. She had taken herself with her, all the impractical, stubborn, difficult, specific parts of herself, the parts that wrote 4 letters to strangers, the parts that sat in Hargrove's small office and said, "I want to fight it," the parts that crouched in mud on a boardwalk in a town she didn't belong to yet, and pressed a handkerchief against a stranger's knee. Those parts had gotten her here. Eli said something to Silas about the fence post situation, and Silas said something back that made Walt grunt. And outside the window, the September light was doing its particular work on the cottonwoods, turning them, and the ranch was breathing its slow morning breath. And Adeline Cross, Adeline Boone now, though she sometimes still thought of herself by both names, the way you hold 2 things at once until they settle into one, got up from the table and poured more coffee and started the morning and was home. Not the home she'd imagined in Ohio, laying careful plans in a rented room. Not the home she'd been promised in a series of letters by a man who'd already sold the house before she arrived. Not a home that was given to her or offered to her or owed to her by anyone. A home she'd walked into mud-streaked and broke and stubborn and stayed in and built, one repaired thing at a time. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Outside, the Montana sky did its enormous thing, indifferent and magnificent, the same sky it had been on the day she'd stepped off the train with her trunk and her 31 years and her $11 and her will, which was the only thing Raymond Holt had never gotten his hands on, and the only thing, it turned out, she'd ever really needed. The morning kept going, the ranch kept working. The boy drew horses on his good paper with his good pencils, and the man who'd learned to smile again came in at noon with mud on everything and said, "It smells good in here," and she said, "It's just soup," and he said, "I know," in the voice that meant something else. And Walt ate 2 bowls without commenting, which was the highest praise available in that kitchen. And Pete Duffy finally, definitively, grew a mustache. And the fence posts got fixed, and the cottonwoods turned gold and then let go, and the first snow came in November, and Adeline stood on the porch in the cold and watched it fall on everything, on the barn and the yard and the fence lines and the road that ran 8 miles back to Ash Creek, and further than that back to Ohio, and further than that back to every careful, frightened, hopeful decision that had brought her here. She didn't feel any of those decisions as mistakes, not even the ones that had hurt. They had all, in the end, brought her here. She stood in the snow until she was cold, and then she went inside, where it was warm.